All right, well, how about the path of moral knowledge? Well, let's consider the following item of moral knowledge. It is wrong to torture babies for the fun of it. We put that statement out there. I'm sure no one on X will even remotely or Blue Sky will be able to claim that that's not the case. So it's all something that we can agree on, right? Hopefully. If someone claims he doesn't know that is true, he needs therapy. And not an argument, it is self-evidently and intuitively obvious. It is possible to imagine that if 50 or 100 years from now, most people will no longer believe this truth, but it's hard to see what evidence, arguments, or other rational considerations could be discovered in that time frame that would make it completely irrational belief to hold.
Exactly. And so he compares this with, beliefs about electrons. He says, is the same thing true of beliefs about electrons? And he says, not at all, as the history of our understanding of the electron demonstrates. And he gives us some, kind of a history lesson here, real brief one, right? He says, consider the different views on electrons held by J.J. Thomson in the early 1900s and Niels Bohr during the same period and versus contemporary quantum physics. He says Thomson, an English physicist who won the Nobel Prize in Physics and is credited with discovering and identifying the electron, so that's a big deal, right? Held that electrons were, notice this, non-orbiting, negatively charged particles embedded in an atom, much like raisins are embedded in plum pudding, right? So the plum pudding theory of electron is what we got from J.J. Thomson.
So obviously we can't argue with the guy that discovered it, but where would we be without scientists who disagree with each other? Well, Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist who also won the Nobel Prize in Physics and made important observations about quantum theory and atomic structure, he disagreed. I disagree with Mr. Thomson over here, probably Dr. Thomson. Rather than viewing electrons as non-orbiting, he argued that they do orbit, but only in discrete, specific circular orbitals at specific energy levels. And if you've taken your classes in chemistry, boy, you know those models. So you probably know where this is going. Well, the current model of the electron is part of the modern quantum theory. And one interesting feature of current quantum theory is whether or not the constitutions of the universe include electrons should be taken as physical or non-physical according to some form of metaphysical idealism. So even with the discovery of it, we don't actually know if they're real or not real, or physical or not physical, more like. So we're there. We know, looking back 50 years from now, we definitely know we're only in the truth statements right now, where there's nothing that will change.
That's right. My goodness. And so what is this point? Well, he says we no longer believe that the Thomsonian electrons exist. All features of Bohr electrons have been retained in current theory. It's legitimate to question as to whether or not there ever were any such things as Bohr electrons, given what we know about electrons today. And so he says, why did he take us through this mini crash course on the history of electrons? Well, because his key point, and here it is. Over time, as the science of a particular area moves on, it is often the case that older views of some entity are abandoned, and in light of current theory, scientists no longer believe that they were such a thing. Well, if that's the case, if science can be wrong, then how can be the ultimate source of knowledge? That's the problem that he's pointing out here.
Right. We all believe in the electron, right? And we all believe that babies should not be tortured. Well, in 50 years and 100 years, which one of those two will still be around? Both of them? Neither of them? One or the other? That's the question. Well, the second reason for believing somewhat tentative about belief in electrons derives from the debate between realism and anti-realism in science. Very fun one if you're going to take your philosophy of science, is this debate. Very roughly, a scientific realism holds that the entities that populate our successful theories, things like electrons and current views of matter and atom, are real, and that the theory descriptions of those entities are true, or at least approximately true.
And by contrast, he tells us in one way or another, the various versions of anti-realism claim that a successful theory is just that, merely successful. And so the success of a theory has, notice this, no implications whatsoever for the ontology or the reality of the unobservable entities under consideration, right? So just because it's successful doesn't mean that the things that they are positing as being in existence are true, right? And so thus, even though electron theory is successful, that does not mean that electrons actually exist, and as evidence of their view, anti-realist, he tells us, cite several theories in the history of science that were successful for a long time, but that we now believe were false, right? So this is, I think it's sometimes called the pessimistic meta-induction. Objection to realism is what this is sometimes called in the literature, right? So you look at, these various successful theories and, you say, all you really want is a successful theory. Doesn't matter whether or not it's true. In fact, many theories that we thought were successful in the past turned out not to be the case. And therefore, we don't need truth with regard to theories. All we need is success. Right. That's all scientists should be looking for.
I mean, the biggest realization was when we were in physics 2, and we, as a collective class, gasped when we realized that Newtonian mechanics was false and didn't work anymore. But we just paid really good money to learn how wrong we were. And so that's always fun to teach physics and then kind of blow the little ones' minds a little bit by them.
You could have learned it at on the back of a bubblegum wrapper.
Listen, I'm going to save you $15,000. You won't believe me, but your kids will enjoy this. So, yeah. Well, for Moreland, it doesn't seem to him to matter whether or not is a realist or an anti-realist for the point that he's trying to make. The point is this: it's important for the lay community to know that, one, that there is this realist, anti-realist debate, two, that the intelligent advocates on both sides, and three, even if one opts for realism, the mere presence of sophisticated versions of anti-realism would seem to require a realist to temper his or her certainty about the reality of the entities. They're strong head charge, and then here comes the anti-realist to say, hold on, is it true or does it just work? And then they go, skirt, 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 maybe. Well, I'm pretty sure. I'm 99% sure, not quite 100%.
Yeah. All right. And so he says, for these two reasons, then, the history of theory abandonment, replacement, and change in science. So that's one, right? We abandon theories, we replace them, they're changed. And the presence of robust versions of anti-realism, right? The reality claims of science are often, though perhaps he tells us not always, much less certain than the public and especially the advocates of scientism realize. So there, the point he's making here is these claims to truth may or may are less certain than the scientism folk are really realized because of at least these two issues, the history of theory of replacement and abandonment, and the presence of robust versions of anti-realism. But he says, by contrast, the case for God and for certain ethical claims, right, torturing babies for fun is immoral, is strong. Indeed, it is not foolish to think that our legitimate degree of rational warrant for believing in God and certain ethical claims is greater than what we have for many assertions of science, despite, he tells us, what scientism advocates claim.